From our reading this morning from the first chapter of the book of Revelation. To him who loves us and freed us from our sins by his blood and made us to be a kingdom, priests serving his God and Father, to him be glory and dominion forever and ever. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Please be seated. Today is Christ the King Sunday. It is the last Sunday in the church calendar. Next week we start a new liturgical year with the penitential season of Advent. And once again, as we have for the past few weeks, we have apocalyptic readings. Today, from the book of Revelation. Now, the word apocalypse is a Greek word meaning unveiling. And in these readings, the veil is lifted for a moment. And we catch a dreamlike glimpse of the future. A time when Christ will return and will rule as King. The prayer that we pray so often and that our Lord taught us to pray, Thy kingdom come, will finally be answered. God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven. That is the message that comes through loud and clear in these apocalyptic readings that strive to unveil for us some of the mysteries of God and the future. An interesting historical note. The feast of Christ the King is a fairly recent addition to the church calendar. Pope Pius XI instituted it in 1925 to celebrate Christ's kingship as a way of combating the destructive forces of the age. After the horrors of World War I, and in the face of the gathering forces of totalitarianism in Europe and beyond, Christians needed to be reminded of the promise that Christ's reign will one day be established. And almost a century later, we still need that reminder with all the violence and turbulence happening all over the world, from Syria, Afghanistan, to our own country, with communities shattered by gun violence. So it is important that we continue to mark and celebrate this feast day. But I want to step back for a moment this morning and focus on what it really means, to call Christ our King. Kings are wealthy. They have palaces, land, and money. Christ was born into poverty and remained poor throughout his life. Kings have status. Everyone gives them the utmost respect, either out of genuine admiration or out of outright fear. Christ was a day laborer, trained in carpentry, but with few other marketable skills, an itinerant who lived on the margins of society. Kings have power. When they issue commands, people obey. And their power is usually backed up by force. Christ did not issue very many commands, just a few, like love God and love your neighbor. And clearly, he didn't back those commands with force. He didn't even allow his followers to use force to defend him. As he says to Pontius Pilate in today's gospel lesson from John, "My kingdom is not from this world. If my kingdom were from this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over." So all the things that we typically associate with kings, wealth, status, power, usually backed by force, are the very things that Christ explicitly renounced. And if you recall, wealth, status, and power were the very things the devil offered Jesus during his temptation in the desert. But Christ turned them all down. In a way, calling Christ our King is a contradiction in terms. Saying Christ the King is something like saying Mahatma Gandhi, the dictator, or Nelson Mandela, the tyrant. If Christ has renounced all the attributes of kingship, wherein lies his power? In a word, love. Christ is the King of love. His power is the power of love. The book of Revelation speaks of Christ as the one who loves us and frees us from our sins. And in John's Gospel, Jesus says, "For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth." And the truth is that God always loves us and has already forgiven all of us through Christ. But how does the King of love establish his reign? How can love overcome the powers of this world, or even the forces at work in our own hearts? After all, we live in the real world where wealth and status and force hold sway. We can recognize in ourselves the desire sometimes to get our way, to be in control, even to dominate. How can Christ ever win with his platform of love? It's a beautiful ideal, but is it realistic? On the face of it, the answer would seem to be a resounding no. Christ's love was met with betrayal, torture, and crucifixion. And there are plenty of other examples in history of people who offered love time and again and were rejected, persecuted, even killed. How many times in your own life have you tried to reach out in love only to be rejected or even mistreated? But Christ won even though he was crucified. He won because of the hearts that were and continue to be transformed by his example. He won because he was true to himself and was not overcome by the powers of this world. He won even before he was raised from the dead. But the resurrection serves as God's confirmation that the way of love is the way of life. But the way of love remains precarious, even though Christ won. The reason is that God has given each of us the freedom to say yes to love, or to say yes to the way of the world. And in 1,000 different ways, every single day of our lives, we are confronted with that choice in ways great and small. Are we going to choose the way of love? Or are we going to choose worldly power, the world's way? Are we going to do everything we can as Christians to bring about God's kingdom right here on earth? Or are we going to support the powers of this world, either tacitly or overtly? Indian independence leader Mahatma Gandhi chose the way of love. He decided to respond to the British imperial powers with love rather than with force. The story of great crowds of Indians protesting colonialism without violence has been told many times. How they did not give up or resort to force, although they were shot at, imprisoned, some even lost their lives. Finally, they won their independence. The British withdrew from the subcontinent. But it's important to remember that during the colonial period in India, the eventual outcome was far from certain. Decades later, Gandhi's movement of nonviolence and passive resistance inspired Nelson Mandela in his resistance to apartheid in South Africa, and the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. during the civil rights movement in this country. So love is always precarious. It might not have worked in terms of ending colonialism in India. It might not have worked in achieving equal rights for all, regardless of race, in South Africa. And Lord knows we have a long way to go in this country. But simply by virtue of choosing love rather than vengeance, Gandhi, Mandela, and Reverend King and their legions of followers had already won in a very real sense. So we have a choice to make every day of our lives. Will we respond to the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune with love or with worldly power? Will we offer up our hearts, or will we impose our will? Will we claim Christ as our King, or will we enthrone the powers of this world? I believe we all have a destiny as followers of Christ. Our destiny is to help bring about the kingdom of Christ by deliberately choosing the way of love. As committed Christians, we may not always win in the way the world understands winning. We may lose our economic security, perhaps our social status. It's even possible that a few among us may even be injured or lose our lives. But we will gain our souls. We will enter the kingdom of love and sit at the feet of the one true King. That kingdom is not far off, in the distant future. It is right here, all around us. If we only take a moment to see. It's just waiting for us to choose it. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Amen.